Our next presenter will be Julian Kücklich, talking about the ideology of play.
I'm going to talk about the concept of Playbor, which, as a term, has gained unfortunate or fortunate currency, and which I, for better or for worse, coined or helped to coin with my work on digital games and the way that they're being produced. So, to introduce this talk, I'd like to introduce this character on the screen here, which, does anybody know who that is? Can anybody identify that icon? Okay, it's Manic Miner. He's like the working class hero of the video game generation. And of course, Manic Miner has a direct relationship with the miners' strike in the UK in the 1980s. So it is, and this kind of secret history of the way that play and labor are sort of interrelated in the video game, in the medium of the video game that I'm interested in. And I started thinking about this in the context of computer game modification, of which you see one of the earliest examples here. Computer game modification basically takes an existing video game and changes either the code or the graphics, or both. So it ranges from fairly cosmetic representational changes to the game to so-called total conversions, of which the game Counter-Strike would be the most well-known example, which is a modification of the game Half-Life, but completely changes the gameplay itself and the representational form. What you see here is, of course, a modification of Castle Wolfenstein, which has been changed into Castle Smurfenstein. I won't delve into that in too much detail. What I'm really interested in is what modding actually is and how it works. I became interested in modding because it is, of course, very closely related to the intellectual property regimes that games are embedded in. And what that means is that the work that the modders, people who modify video games, put into these modifications usually ends up being the property of the people who produced the games in the first place. So it's not entirely cut and dried, but usually the end user license agreement that you click through when you install the game pretty much puts it in very clear terms that whatever you do with that game is going to end up being the property of the original producer of that game. So in a very simple and fairly naive point of looking at it would of course just be as a form of textual poaching, where you use an existing cultural text and you sort of change its representational qualities, and you can sort of tweak it in certain ways to fit your own agenda, or simply just to play around with the way that the game presents itself to its users. So this ranges all the way from Castle Smurfenstein to more activist mods like Escape from Woomera, which engages with the situation of asylum seekers in Australia, and puts the user into the shoes, as it were, of one of those interns in a refugee camp in the Australian desert. And then, of course, Tiziana Terranova has been credited a number of times already. There is this concept of free labor that seems quite well suited to describe this sort of phenomenon, where people, just because they can, basically, take an existing game and change it in a certain way, which then is, of course, not just a form of extended play, you might say, where you use the game to different ends than the designers might have had in mind, but you're still engaging with it playfully. At the same time, it is a form of, we could say, productive play, where the product itself is in an intertextual relationship with the original work. And that's what David Marshall calls, that's why he thinks video games are the perfect example of what he calls the intertextual commodity, where you have a sort of source work, but then you have a network of other instances of that work, and all these instances sort of work together to create something that is more pertinent and in a way more durable than the original work, because like many other cultural products, video games are, of course, usually high-risk products that either sell within the first 6 weeks of their being published, or they don't sell at all. So this is basically a way of extending the shelf life of these games. And of course, they work as free marketing. They work up some sort of buzz around the game. You need the original game to play the mods. So it is basically adding value to an existing product. And of course, the mode of doing that and of enabling that is through a form of crowdsourcing, which means that you're basically just offering a platform to people on which they can then base their own creative labor. And yeah, I mean, in many cases, it's also a waste of time, which I think is important. Roger Caillot speaks about play as an occasion of pure waste, which I find a very elegant definition of what play is. But maybe that definition is also historically contingent. I think that's something that often gets erased or forgotten when we speak about play and work and labor and games. That these are, of course, not eternally valuable or internally existing concepts, but they get redefined, they get reconceptualized in various ways. And I think the term Playbor is also meant to convey that sense of a shifting relationship between terms that may historically be seen as fairly occupying opposite ends of a spectrum. So, yeah, what is Playbor? I've been thinking long and hard about this, and the best formulation that I could come up with is it's not work, but it's also not work. And that, of course, harkens back to the way that first Gregory Bateson and then Brian Sutton Smith talk about play. Gregory Bateson in Steps to an Ecology of Mind speaks about play in the context of monkeys that he observes playing at a zoo, and of course what he's interested in is that they're nipping each other, so they're pretending to bite each other, but at the same time it's clear within the context of play that the nip is not a bite. So what he says, it's a form of meta-communication. And then a couple of years later, Brian Sutton Smith comes along and very perceptively points out that, of course, the nip is not a bite, but nip is also not a byte. So in games allow us to engage in these behaviors, and that's of course not only true for monkeys but also for humans, that may be socially sanctioned. And there's various fascinating examples of that, including kissing games in very Puritan societies, et cetera, et cetera. But the important thing is that the behavior that is being signified is, of course, to a certain extent, divorced from its significance, but at the same time, the relationship remains. And I've tried to conceptualize this in a very difficult way using and non-traditional, non-binary forms of logic, but I'm not going to go there because it's going to end up being massively complicated. And maybe it's really neither here nor there. Importantly, I think that's a good shorthand of summing up what Playbor is, that it is not work, but it's also not work. So it means that it is usually voluntary, and it is engaged in for its own sake. So it's autotelic, like play, but it is also productive activity, not necessarily because people want it to be productive, but it ends up being productive precisely because it is embedded in this intertextual relationship, and of course also a social relationship, which we're going to come to in a minute. And its products are, of course, usually rather immaterial rather than material. So they end up being someone's intellectual property, for lack of a better term, or they end up creating communities, which, of course, are also within this intertextual paradigm of source of value for these products. But I think that already makes it quite obvious that it makes it fairly hard to reconcile with traditional conceptualizations that we have of work and play. So it's autotelic and productive at the same time. And I'm going to try to say something about alienation and exploitation as well, which I think needs to be regarded in a different light as well once we talk about this fairly amorphic concept of Playbor. So the other example I wanted to talk about, and I don't know, is Julian Dibble isn't here, is he? I mean, I shouldn't be talking about this because Julian Dibble is the one who did all the interesting work about gold farming and World of Warcraft and various other phenomena. I just want to point out that, of course, massively multiplayer games like World of Warcraft and other virtual worlds work in a similar fashion. They are very much an intertextual commodity where what is created is a form of is a sort of platform, but the actual value is created by those who populate those platforms, by the players themselves. Which is fairly paradoxical. I mean, you could probably draw a couple of parallels to other formations like that, and most of them would be to things like sports clubs, etc. But I think the interesting thing here is that we're dealing with social networks on a very massive scale. So we have millions of users spread all over the world. And while there is, of course, content that is being provided, what is actually pertinent about these worlds is the context, the social and cultural context in which players in these worlds are embedded. And that's something that can, to a certain extent, be designed into the gameplay of those games, but at the same time, you can't achieve that without players engaging with players and performing something that could be characterized as effective labor. And the other thing is, of course, that some of the tasks that players have to fulfill within massively multiplayer games like World of Warcraft are very repetitive and are referred to as grinding. So it actually becomes quite a laborious task to develop your character to a higher level. And I think the best and densest metaphorical expression of that is that I was able to find is the fact that you can install a plugin for World of Warcraft that allows you to play Bejeweled within World of Warcraft. So while your character is grinding away and I don't know, mining iron ore or killing rats or something, you can automate that process to a certain extent, and then you can actually just sit there and monitor your character working away while you yourself are playing a game within the game. So it's this curious doubling that I think also expresses the way that that play and labor are intertwined in these contexts. So now I want to talk a little bit about the ideology of play, which I think is basically something that I can only define negatively. It cloaks or masks what is really going on when we're talking about computer game modification or the generation of value through effective labor in virtual worlds or within massively multiplayer games. So the generation of value is put under erasure by the fact these environments are presented and present themselves as games, and of course they are games, they're playful, but at the same time what is happening within them is that a form of sociality is being produced and is stabilized through the repetition of fairly simple interactions between the players. So we could use the term of the social factory to describe this. I like the term of the social factory because on the one hand it is a factory that produces the social, and on the other hand it is a form of sociality that is organized to a certain extent, like a factory that is organized to be productive. And I think to further flesh out what I mean by the term Playbor is that its actual value resides in the creation of social ties. It resides in the fact that it is so deeply and almost inextricably intertwined with the production of sociality. So the question now is, of course, whether or not this concept of Playbor is useful only within the context of digital games, or whether we can also talk about other situations, other sites in which users perform similar functions, such as social networking sites, or media sharing sites such as Flickr or YouTube, where again, of course, their function depends on the production of a form of sociality, and you achieve that by playing around with the medium, right? I mean, you're not explicitly given instructions on how to interact with Facebook, and you're not given explicit instructions on how to interact with YouTube. It's something that is very much at play and is explored through trial and error in a similar way that the rules of video games are hardly ever explicitly formulated, but are left to discover for the player. And so it's that kind of relationship, this playful relationship with new media that might enable us to use this concept of Playbor within other contexts as well. And I'm also interested in a phenomenon that I see emerging, especially in sites like Facebook, which I call collusion, for a fairly obvious reason. I mean, collusion is a way of playing etymologically, is to play together. But of course, it has also these fairly unsavory connotations of making backroom deal between corporations or other actors. So an examples of that, of course, would be something like the Facebook translation project, where Facebook goes out and says, "Hey users, we have a great English site here, but we also want a German and a French and a Russian site. So we thought rather than hiring programmers, we would go out to you users, and you can do the translation for us." And quite a lot of users responded, maybe not as enthusiastically as Facebook expected, but quite a lot of users responded to that and said, "Yeah, we think that's a great idea, and we want to have our Russian friends to have Facebook in Russian as well." Something even more worrying is going on when we talk about things like the not so recent Facebook Democracy Initiative, where Facebook creates this simulacrum of a democratic process and says, well, here are our user guidelines, and we want our users to discuss them, but at the same time we make sure that through a fairly bureaucratic process nothing will ever come of that, because they define certain limits for participation, or minimum thresholds for participation, and I think fairly cynically made sure that their core demographic was apathetic enough not to engage with this process, and I find it hard to think that they were taking any risk with actually trying to involve their users, particularly because they're leaving a back door open for themselves and say, even if there is a consensus among our users that the terms of use need to be changed, this is still the property of Facebook, and we can either terminate the service altogether, or we can re-implement our own terms of service at any point. So, I mean, this harkens back to what maybe a bit in a fairly facetious way has been called the Auschwitz of Facebook. But yeah, I also wanted to say something, as I said, about alienation and exploitation in these contexts. And I think what is specific, particularly to social networking sites, is that alienation is the result here of a process of disowning personal information. Speaking literally and metaphorically here, it's a common knowledge that whatever you put on what you put online in sites like Facebook is no longer your property, and it becomes the property of the provider. But at the same time, it also means that it sort of becomes somebody else's property, so it's no longer a part of your personality that much, which I think works both ways. Here's a brief shot of myself posturing in various disguises, which I think is a good way of summing up what I'm trying to say, which is that exploitation in these arenas is underwritten not only by processes of objectivation or objectification, where and the user is more or less reduced to a data set, but at the same time, there are processes of subjectivation, or subjectification going on where users actually negotiate their identity through the way that they're being addressed, and at the same time try to resist this form of address by, for example, posturing as various characters, changing their names. I mean, that's the kind of play that's becoming more and more prevalent. I set up a Facebook account for my bicycle, and these kinds of things. But I think what is interesting about it is that this objectifying form of address is intertwined with strategies of subjectification, and what we end up with is a form of multitudinous intersubjectivity. So to bring this back to the question of what Playbor is, I think it is precisely a form of labor that is exploited and exploitable, but it's not entirely alienated because it allows for the users to embed certain aspects of their subjectivity into this process. And that is true for all of these examples that I've mentioned, whether it's the modding of digital games or whether it's the way that users interact in massively multiplayer role-playing games, or whether it is the management of social networks on Facebook. So I would posit, as probably highly contentious, that within this context, exploitation is not simply the reduction of a human being to commodity, the commodity, of course, being labor power, but a complex process of alienation and liberation. So I'm coming to the end, and I want to talk briefly about the Mechanical Turk. So this is a sort of hyperlink to the other panel that's going on at the same time. I think the Mechanical Turk is interesting because, first of all, of course, it is a machine within which a human pretends to be a machine. And that is also true for a lot of the crowdsourcing processes that we're talking about, where what is actually going on is a form of artificial intelligence. Right? We use the crowd, the multitude, for tasks that a computer cannot compute, that are not computable. But we use them in the form that we would use a machine. So the user, the human user, is always hidden within those machines. And it, of course, is at the same time a pertinent metaphor of the situation of immaterial laborers on the internet who are in a way hidden, and they're also cloaked within the ideology of play, as I said, yet at the same time subjectivities that have to perform their role in a virtuosic way. So the Mechanical Turk, I think, cuts across all these different examples that I was talking about and can represent both the Playbors of digital games production and the virtuosos of social networking. And as a final conjecture, I'd say, I think it's also evident that the Mechanical Turk is what I call a deludic device. I'm very interested in cheating in digital games and other contexts. So I try to sum up cheating and being a spoil sport and other activities and practices like that as a form of deludic play, which of course, again draws together something that is not ludic and that tries to break down what Hausinger calls the magic circle of play, but at the same time it's something that deludes. So in this instance, it's of course very evident that the Mechanical Turk as a machine is intended to delude the opponent into thinking that they're playing against a machine rather than a human. And it maybe draws attention to the possibilities. I mean, this, again, is a very contentious question of dilutic strategies of resistance and refusal, which means somebody mentioned Baudrillard's injunction to smash the code earlier, and I think the dilutic strategies are precisely not an attempt to smash the code, but to find the loopholes in the code and to use the exploits that the code offers in order to find ways to, refuse, as I said, the form of address, the objectifying form of address that these various technologies offer to the user. And, again, and the examples are probably not that interesting. I mean, there's probably more interesting ways of engaging with this, but
Julian.
yeah, I'm over. Okay, yeah. All right. Okay, so I'll just, as a way of bringing this back to the question of the erotics of Playbor, I'll just leave this image of giant penises in Second Life stand. And thanks very much.
My name is Julian Kücklich. I'm at Media Design Hochschule in Berlin, where I teach digital game design. So that's also the perspective that I'm coming from at this conference. I've been doing quite a lot of research on digital games, but in the last 3, 4, 5 years, I've been particularly interested in the modes of production within the digital games industry and outside of the digital games industry. So I'm interested in things like computer game modification, user-generated content, and particularly in the last 2 years maybe, I've been very interested in questions of governance of virtual worlds and massively multiplayer games, and the question how players are implicated in the production of those worlds. And the term that I'm using to describe that is a neologism, maybe an unfortunate neologism, which is Playbor. So I'm drawing together play and labor, which, at least from my point of view, works fairly well in the context of digital games production. In my presentation today, I was trying to explore or tease out to what extent that can be extended to other domains, particularly social networking sites such as Facebook, and possibly even beyond that. So I'm really starting out from an analysis of computer games modification as a very early example. Computer game modification began in the 1980s and then gathered steam in the 1990s, of an early example of how computer game players become involved and, one could say, implicated in the production of computer games. And I think the interesting thing about that is that already in these early forms we can discern a particularly interesting blurring of the line between play and labor, or between play and work, because on the one hand it is an extension of play and it is a voluntary form of work that is going on here, but on the other hand, of course, there is an expropriation of value going on, because these modifications are being used not only to extend the brand of the computer games themselves and their manufacturers, they're also used to prolong the shelf life of the products themselves, because you need the original product to play those modifications. So it's a sort of intertextual commodity, if you will. That's the term that David Marshall uses. And of course, they also, there are also more intangible benefits to the manufacturers of games insofar as it creates a very loyal and very deeply involved community around their games. And then I'm taking that forward to look at the way that massively multiplayer games are set up, where even players who aren't that deeply implicated into the community are in a way creating the community itself, insofar as the games are only platforms for a sort of social form of play. So we could describe them, to use Antonio Negri's term, as social factories, in which what is getting produced is actually a certain form of sociality, and that is cloaked or masked, from my point of view, by an ideology of play. So what is happening is that, of course, the players are engaged in various playful forms of engaging with this technology and with this medium, but at the same time, they are perpetuating the value proposition that these games have, namely to offer a certain kind of sociality. And this is, of course, something that we can also observe on social networking sites such as Facebook, for example, or maybe Twitter is an even more interesting example of that, because there is an aspect of a form of performance on the side of the user that is very virtuosic, and not only in the sense that they have to manage their connections and have to manage their network, but they also have to think in a way about marketing themselves and branding themselves. So what is going on there is something that could be described as a shift to a more entrepreneurial model of subjectivity that gets defined and negotiated through these technologies. I think it's a great opportunity to be here and to look at this not only from the perspective of play, but also from the perspective of labor, which is something very unique for me personally, because I'm mostly talking to play theorists and gamers. So it's fascinating to see how other people coming from different perspectives respond to that. So it's fantastic to be here.